Welcome to the Beyond Sunday podcast, everyone, where we take your faith beyond Sunday and into your everyday life. My name is Clayton. I'm the lead pastor of Trinity New Life Church, and yes, I'm actually on this podcast. I am joined by the person who is here when I am not here, and here when I am here, Chael Branda, our executive director.
Hey, everybody.
I just want to let you know that Chael gave me no attitude and no sarcasm about whether or not I remembered how to record a podcast before we started this. So I appreciate the welcome back.
Wow. Talk about throwing me under the bus so early. There was a lot.
I was already under the bus.
There was a lot of me on the podcast over the last few weeks. So this is a little bit of the welcome back. Can you please help out? Because I'm tired of listening to my own voice at this point in time.
I think you're more tired of editing.
That too.
There we go.
There was a reason why the podcast last week had no video.
Right.
Because one, if Chael equates editing, it's not going to happen usually, but so welcome back.
Right.
Now we're back on the YouTubes. We're back on all of the things and all of the places.
Yeah.
All done properly.
Because
you're home. Welcome back. I'm so excited.
So if you'd like to continue this conversation with us on the Beyond Sunday podcast, you can always do so on podcast at trinitynewlife.com, or our Instagram is the main Trinity New Life feed. That's where you can get notified about updates. You can subscribe to the podcast, like Chael said, on YouTube. You can get it on Spotify. It's on our app. It's more available than you are prepared to listen to it.
Right.
I'd say that. So this was our last Sunday of the Amazing Grace series. We talked about a serving grace. Chael, can you give us a brief recap of the message?
It was all about serving grace.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so let's get to...
It's been just an incredible series as we've talked about how important this word grace is to the foundation of our faith.
Right.
And we're talking about the way that we can use and intertwine the words both grace and mercy, and how different they are, and how important this idea of grace, how we are given this gift that we just do not deserve, and how it not only how God gives it to us, but how we respond to that grace. And this week I felt was just a really great weekend where we were talking about how when we're given this grace, when we have this grace, it is a grace that sometimes we respond to it in ways that are completely selfless. Like we have to do things we don't do things for the grace. Like we can't work for the grace. So when we respond to it, we do things because we've been called to do it, not because we're trying to earn these moments. And particularly in the way that we serve people and we serve the church, and you had a great example of just when you were sick. It's one of those moments of like, you hate being sick, but then when you get good moments and good preaches out of it, you're like, all right, here's a good sermon example. I get it as I'm dying. But talking about how in these moments, and really how when we're coming into our Christian faith, we come in with nothing. But yet God loves us enough to see us in our nothingness and be able to be, let me lavish out on you, let me pour out on you. And this idea of when we become a Christian, when we receive that grace from God, how can we look at situations, look at our families, look at our friends, look at our church, and be like, how can I pour out into this with no expectation of something in return?
Right, which is a very different kind of serving and a very different kind of expectation than normally a lot of people have, which is why it's so important for us to make sure that we've got a mindset shift into that. One of the things that I think, just even to do a little series recap, because this is your first series podcast of 2020. That's true. To do a little series recap, I think one of the main things that I wanted people to walk away with, and one of the reasons why we read them every week, was an understanding of the difference between mercy and grace and mercy, how they are intertwined, but they are not the same. They are not interchangeable.
Right.
And to be able to understand the difference between those two, because when people talk about, by your grace, to really be able to put an understanding, a fullness of that behind that definition, I think is really important to understand that God is giving us something from His glory, from His grace. He gives us not just, He can give us spiritual gifts, spiritual graces. He can give us the grace of faith. He can give us the grace of victory. There's ways that He is working inside of us and working on our behalf, not in substitute of our working and participation, but to understand that and why we need that. Why is it amazing? What's going on there? One of the things that was in my notes, and Colin didn't dive as deep into it as I would have, but again, what he had to do with my notes was, and he didn't get any explanation of this from me.
Yeah, you did not walk him through any of it. So
I was not barely alive.
He was getting secondhand thought, like, 'cause
Right.
I was walking him through. Oh, I think this is where it's that. Anyways,
Right.
fun.
So one of the, we use the Ephesians 2, 8 through 9 and 10 passage every week. That's a very famous passage that I think talks specifically why I like it and why I think so many people use it is it does such a great job of contrasting the work of God and the work of man. And it really, in the language that Paul uses, there's nowhere to go to try to find your own goodness and your own usefulness. And that's why I think it's really important. And then to be able to, one of the things that stood out to me in this kind of time of meditating through it and thinking through it was, when we look at our own works, we tend to over elevate our goodness and undervalue our badness. That we are better than we think we are and not as bad as we think we are. And most of the time, to convince of the need for grace and mercy, we talk a lot about, look, we're badder than we think we really are. We actually are worse. But one of the things was we also, in coming and needing the grace, if we still think, though, we might acknowledge, hey, our badness has room, is worse than we thought. But if we think the response to that is, well, let me be gooderer and just up my goodness.
This is making me cringe in so many levels. Go on, continue.
But if we keep thinking how good we are,
right,
then we just need to hit the gas on that. The importance is not only to understand, no, we're actually worse than we thought we were, but our goodness is not as good as we think it is.
Right.
You have to concede that what you assume to be good is not actually that good. And until you do that, you don't actually admit your need for the grace and mercy of God. And so those two things, our badness is worse than we thought, but also our goodness is not as good as we thought, leaves us in a place of going, well, I need something that is far beyond who I am and what I can do. And that's why the grace doesn't become helpful or nice or a bonus. That's why the grace becomes amazing at that point, because it does something beyond the capacity of humanity to save itself.
right. If we are always like, I think that's such a great tension of this idea of we can tend to go to we're the worst of all things. I think people can tend to find that moment a little bit easier than to find that, oh, we're not as good as we thought we were. In our good moments, we think, this is great, this is awesome. But when you take our measurements and you line them up with scripture, or you line them up with the way Jesus behaved and taught, like, you realize that our good isn't that great. And when you have that, that's,
why do you call me good? Who is good?
Who is good? Where is your standard? Like, that's something we talk about. We talk about that a lot when we're talking evangelism sometimes, like the idea of, well, who defines good, who defines bad? How do you find those moral lines and different things? And when you put it up against what Scripture says and how Scripture lays this out, that's when you see the need for a Savior. That's when you see the need for, oh, this isn't how I thought it was. This isn't where it's at. And we realize that even the goodest of good has to have that moment of there's something better. There is still something more perfect. There's something out there that has a standard so much higher than anything that we could put on ourselves or line up. And I like just the whole concept of amazing grace when you put it up to those standards is real amazing, like in that idea of things.
Yeah.
So.
And then into this message in particular, we talked about that if we've been given gifts, we have to use those gifts to be able to serve others. We try to lay out as many practical ways for people to be able to do that as possible, whether it's serving in impact teams, discipleship groups, not that those are either or, that's usually a both and. Impact teams are Sunday morning. There are no discipleship groups that take place during any of our 3 services.
Nope.
There's a couple that take place after the Sunday services, none during, so you can accomplish both at the same time. Whether it's students and shine and just but I think that comes from a place of serving in general. When you look at a way, you look at your life in such a way to say, well, I have my serving moments over here, I have my receiving moments over here, And if I'm not in one of these two, then I don't know that I'm going to be able to engage in it. Wherever you are, and this is a little bit of the whole next series that we're going to be getting into, is talking about that you've got to start thinking about ways to honor and worship God outside of church service. That doesn't mean that you stop thinking about it when it comes to church service, but you have to think beyond that.
Hopefully it's a little bit easier when you're in church to be thinking and serving God. But how do you push into the other areas and the other times?
Right. And talking about the difference of the kind of service where you don't get anything in return. You're just serving because you've been gifted to serve. And not viewing it of like, well, I am just blessing you guys. Because sometimes, like we said the message, sometimes you actually get to serve with your gift. And other times, the biggest service you provide is filling a need.
Right.
And that is a gift. That is a grace in that moment to a family, to a spiritual family. So I assume, since you have no papers here, that we did not get any questions.
We did not get any questions.
We did not get any questions.
To be fair, I might not have checked.
You might not have. Well, they forward to your email.
Well, they did not email questions. Let's put it that way. I didn't check.
Nobody
the locker
emailed
room.
questions.
Nobody emailed questions. I don't know if they commented on the locker room post. Usually not, though. People, the questions are dwindling.
And so I'm just going to always assume that when we don't have questions, that the sermon has been explained so incredibly well that there are no follow-up items that we have from
understand.
There.
They've all...
And I will be able to stay right in that assumption until we get any questions or follow-up. Now, here's the thing, guys. Starting with the 167 series, you got your discipleship groups. Everybody's doing sermon application during the 167. If you've got some cheat questions that you'd like to, well, how do I come prepared for my discipleship group? How do I apply this? If you think about it and send it in, we can help you out with that. I have some questions.
You have questions? Well, let's answer your questions. You can answer your questions.
Some questions. No, I'm not going to answer my own.
Well, this is going to be fun.
My own questions. So I've only been a part of 2 churches. I did not grow up going to church. I was part of a youth group around here for a little bit. But then when I went to Tallahassee, went to Florida State, I was in a church there and was a part of that church until I moved here.
And then you
which I started, right.
Yeah. So,
and I'm going to keep going. I think I'm going to keep going.
I hope so.
I'm turning in my membership app.
These last 2 weeks haven't
Yeah. But so I have never looked for a church. Now, you've been a part of 17 different churches.
Not that many, but...
Excommunicated out of less than half of them.
That's not true.
But you have looked... You've had to look and determine, like, are we looking for this church? Are we moving into this? Okay. What has helped you or what has hindered you in being able to quickly connect in to those churches? What mindsets, what activities, what circumstances were a part of you quickly connecting? Or were there ones where you're like, look, we really never connected there?
So I think I actually counted this because we talked about this, I think on the last podcast a little bit of, I think it's 7 churches.
I wasn't there. We can do it again.
Right. I think it was 7 churches that I've been a part of since birth because my dad was a pastor when I was born. So, we had a church in our house. So I was at church my first Sunday on earth. So I think it's 7 churches total. Of those 7 churches, we've only actually looked for a church one time. So every other time we never went out to look for a church.
Meaning you knew where you were going.
Right. So when I graduated high school, went to college. When I moved back, I just started attending the church that Mike had been a part of. Were you going there during college? Off and on. I mean, when I was home on a weekend. But Mike usually came up to visit me when I was gone for my freshman year.
They don't have colleges near USF? There are churches near USF?
I wasn't at USF. I was up at Flagler, and we had a church on campus. So it was just like the campus church, and that was just where I went.
But you looked for that one?
Because I didn't have a car. I guess I...
You just wandered the campus on Sunday mornings? You're like, what?
I would not qualify that.
When
I came home, I went to church with Mike. And so up in St. Augustine, Christian Life Worship Center. And that is where Mike's kids' church pastors So when he was in kids' church, his kids' church pastors had started a church.
Got
and
it.
so he was a part of that because of their influence in his life when he was a kid. So there you go, children's pastors and church kids directors. The impact that you have can last a lifetime. But
The secret of every large church launch
is to find all the little connects that you used to be
is
over.
almost always done by a youth pastor who had a long-term 5-year plus ministry in the area.
I totally get that. I'm still in
Like,
contact
wow,
with
so many people are at launch. How is this possible? Like, well, you were a youth pastor in the area for a long time, and a lot of those people probably liked you.
Hey, probably so. But no,
I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying it's
so we kind of just transitioned from one church to another based upon where like a church staff or church leader was going for very early. But after
it's like Meet the Leader Part 2.
this is kind of wow. So but there was a time when our church was transitioning, and Mike and I just knew we were not supposed to be a part of that transition.
CLWCCW
something
CCLI,
like that. And
CCM.
so, but we had small kids at the time, and so we were like, "What's God got for us?" Like we really had that genuine question of like, maybe God's calling us to a new church. Where would He be calling us? Let's go. And so we actually experienced. It was actually a great season of our life in the idea. Looking back to what I'm doing now, like we went and visited probably 20 churches in the Tampa area at that time. And we would go in, and we had kids, so we were like looking at these things. And we never gave it a single Sunday. We always try to find the way to connect in. Like, this is a place where we wanted to raise kids. That was
that's
the only
almost
stipulation.
a year.
Yeah, it really was. About a year.
Because if you're going to 20 places,
it really was probably
and
about
you're giving
a year.
a couple of them more than one.
Oh, yeah. Or we go to like a Wednesday night service or a Sunday night service if they had it and there are things. But one of the biggest things that we found in that was twofold. Could we make a connection on a Sunday? Could we find somebody who would look for us the next week or would find us the moment or would have something beyond a, hey, hi, nice to meet you. What's your name? Like, and having that conversation always meant something more to Mike and I. But by the second or third time that we would visit a place, we'd visit a church, at that point in time, it sounds really funny, but we would always look at how for me personally, I would always look at how the volunteers would interact with the elements around them. So if we walked in, because we had 3 very small children at the time, and if maybe one of my kids might have knocked over a basket of bulletins, for example, one time, and like to see how their volunteers would interact and how they would like that always meant something.
Jaden or Michael.
Michael.
Okay. It's definitely not Hannah.
Definitely not Hannah. But the way that they interacted, not just with the kid, but with the situation, and were they quick to respond? Were they thinking through these types of things? That always meant something to both Mike and I, because both Mike and I know how we would have responded in those situations. So watching the way their volunteers served on a Sunday or on a Wednesday or on a Sunday night, or even if they had volunteers, always was something that stood out very quickly to Mike and I. Mike and I have never been people who could sit still long. Don't know if you know this. Mike plays guitar. And I did say this on the Meet the Leader podcast. Most young church plants hear musician and get very excited about that. So I would say that Mike always served first, no matter where we went to church ever, because he played an instrument and everybody needed a musician. So it was, for us, the way that even that information came out, the kind of questions that they would talk and ask Mike, always meant something for when we were going to eventually want to serve and different things. And for us, it actually we ended up finding Harborside in that time, in Safety Harbor. And one of the many reasons that we stayed there was the very first Sunday we were there, we had a friend who was playing in the band, and Mike went up to talk to him after, and the worship leader immediately just connected with Mike beyond just a name, but it wasn't about, at that point in time, it wasn't about the guitar. It was actually about something else. I don't remember what it was they connected on. And Mike walked away and goes, man, I could be really good friends with him. Like, I could really see something beyond. And it was like, okay, well, let's check this out.
Does this guitar pedal remind you of this kind of fishing
They
lure?
did. It was
probably
something weird. Did I answer the question? Was that like?
I don't know. What helped you though?
Me? Oh goodness.
What helped you? But again, we talked about serving. We talked about serving with your gifting. We talked about serving where things are needed. What did you see? What did you find generally came first for you? Did you get to jump in and say, this is the best use of who I am first? And how many places did that ever
honestly
come to pass?
I think that goes back to some of the...
I mean, we've all heard the Meet the Leader podcast.
Hopefully
clearly
everyone's done a few
been
things.
fully unleashed here for the first time due to superior leadership.
Due to superior leadership. That is absolutely true. Okay, so that's interesting because I would say that I actually have... I'm trying to word this correctly for all the people listening, the ones of people. Mike has always been the more valuable player when we went to a church to start off, which was fine for me as a woman that tends to be in the church world. That tends to be what happens. And so...
Well, you don't let anybody know you can play the keys.
That's true. Very few people know I play piano. So when he would get in, my first and foremost role always in a church was
roadie.
Like, how can I help? Like, can I so if Mike was packing up gear, can I stack chairs? Can I sweep a floor? Can I pack? I can do over under on cables. I have been trained properly to do those types of things. And so I would fill time just cleaning, honestly. The first thing I did in most churches I was ever a part of was to just clean, which is and I don't say this like egotistically, that's not the best use of some of my time is to clean, but it was someplace that I could start doing that.
Well, that's kind of the point that we're talking about, is that not everything is the best use of your time.
That's true. Yes.
Not just you, but the plural you. Not everything that you do is the best use of your time.
But it was something that was a great way for me to just start conversations.
And sometimes it's the most needed thing.
Right. Well, and it was as I would do that, I would just start talking to people. I get to know people. That's how I got to know the heart of so many people in the different churches. That's when I started getting... Mike obviously started playing at Harborside. He got connected to the youth pastor in one of those moments. That's when he started doing youth worship for the first time at Harborside Church. And then once Mike started doing that, I was starting to get the itch of I needed to do something. And we luckily had parents that lived in the area, so it was like, hey, let's drop the kids off, and our date night became youth night. Like, we would go to youth together, and we would serve. Mike would do worship, and I would oversee the high school girls group and different things, and that was our time together, and we enjoyed that, and slowly started working. But even there, the first thing I did in youth ministry at Harborside, I'd been a youth pastor for about 4 years prior to Harborside, but the first thing I did at Harborside in their thing is I handled snacks. That's what I did. I would make sure I would go to the grocery store. I would buy things. I would come set it all up, clean it all up, feed the kids,
Mm-hmm.
But for me, that was the best way to get to know the kids, because if you don't know teenagers, they like food.
They do.
And so that was a great way for her to do. So I think that was always, and I would say because really the two churches that I came in more undercover, nobody really knew who I was, would be Harborside and Trinity. Everywhere else we ever transitioned to, we were coming from a church staff, or my parents were involved in the church. So I grew up in the
Mm-hmm.
so to Harborside.
I mean, Emily knew you.
People
Mason,
knew me
obviously.
at Trinity, but nobody knew to the extent I was teaching at the time when we started at Trinity. Ministry wasn't not a career. I was not coming in as a career in ministry when I came to Trinity, or Harborside even. And being able to just start with what was offered, or what can I be faithful with. That was really a big key for, I think, especially here at Trinity. It was just being given opportunities to go, hey, what can I do with this? How can I lead with this? How can I work with this? How can I make this my own? Because maybe it's not what I thought my callings or my giftings were, but if my callings and my giftings were to be faithful, which I think is most, when you get down to the root of what God's called us to be, that's really what it is. I was like, well, I'll do this. I'll do snacks for a youth group on Sunday night. I'll do, eventually lead a high school girls Sunday school class. But
yeah, I think that what you're saying, fruitfulness and faithfulness, because now you're at the position where you're the one trying to help people get fit.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's where we both are.
Yeah.
We're trying to help people get fit right. And the people who desire leadership, because we've we've both been the people who desire leadership.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't think that that's gone away. I mean, for me, that there's a level of that when it comes to our denomination. I mean, I can't necessarily, I could give myself more titles here at TNLC, but my functional role.
But you don't want to be called a senior or anything because
it's still not senior yet. Yeah. My functional roles have not, they wouldn't really go anywhere here at TNLC. I would be able to do that and create that, but there are opportunities or things that I look for within our denomination or different
Right.
things outside of TNLC that I'd like opportunities to be able to do. So I still have a desire for some level of that when it comes to leadership. And for you, unless things have changed in the last 2 weeks where we haven't done the podcast, which not that we haven't talked, but you're not looking for your church planning plan where you're going to go out and launch that. But there are things that we've talked about with putting on different conferences, leadership consulting, things that, I don't know if it's me pushing you into the area or you pushing yourself into the area, whatever it would be, that there's still those opportunities where you go, oh, I want to look at how I might be able to grow and change in these particular environments. So we still have some of that, but when we're looking at the people who are now asking for those environments, I think it's really tough because having been this, to be able to communicate to somebody, your talent is not always enough because I don't want to say this in a disparaging way. I mean this more in a differentiating way. For us here at TNLC, talent is not enough. Faithfulness, fruitfulness, DNA are a large part of that, especially when it comes to leadership.
Right.
I don't need you to be a generic leader. I need you to be a TNLC leader.
Right.
I don't know that you're necessarily going to be able to close your eyes and perfectly say all of the cultural values. But if you can say none of the cultural values other than not just friendly but sticky,
Right.
then I'm wondering.
Yeah. I think that there is,
So just as an example of the things that we look for, I mean, like I really do look for like fruitfulness and faithfulness. If somebody comes to me and says, I want to serve, but I only serve here, I become incredibly skeptical and am not excited to try to find a way to make that work.
I think that there's, and this is so, the way God is just incredible and graceful, and is the idea of when God's giving you talents and he's giving you these things, depending on what season you are, like he's going to exercise those in other ways. So while I might have been stacking chairs to start with at a church, I was leading in other areas. Like God was perfecting my skills and talents in other areas at that time. So I was needed, like the faithfulness, what God needed me to do right there was to stack chairs or to clean a stage, because there were other areas of my life that I needed to push into. Like I was learning a ton about administration in another place at that time. My leadership skills were actually in a classroom and learning how to manage 45 high schoolers at the time. Like that's where my talents were being perfected, not in the ministry life. Mike and I have had numerous conversations about like our time at Harborside, and it was just a very unique season for us. Like we look back and it's just, what was God, we've asked the question, like, what was God doing? Like, God was imparting a lot of what I needed for my current role and my current position, the season that he's got me in now, that I had no idea he was doing at the time. And if I had looked at any of that, Harborside's a very large church. If I had walked into that church and gone, hey, I really think I could help you by doing these things and only these things here, I would have missed a huge lesson that God was really putting into me in order to come to TNLC and be able to operate in the way that I do at TNLC. And I think that we tend to have these images or these expectations in our heads of how God wants us to use our talents, and we forget that there are so many. I'm not the only person in the world who wears, several different hats. I'm mom, I'm wife, I'm executive director, I'm a daughter, I'm a sister. Like I do a ton of different things. I volunteer at organizations outside of TNLC.
Right.
Like I do these things like because in the different areas, God wants to take our talent and take our skills and teach and train and build us up. And if we're not willing to go into these different things and go, okay, God, where do you want me to be in this place? I have learned a lot about serving an organization with no leadership because I volunteer outside of TNLC. I go to Hannah and I volunteered at Brooker Creek Preserve for the last several years. Like we walk in and
where you have no leadership. Not that there is no leadership.
Not that there is no leadership. There's definitely leader. We have just zero leader. We are a number. Like, and that's not a bad thing. But we go in and we do a ton of things. But we learn, like, man, I wouldn't give that up for anything because it's helped me think about, oh, maybe we should, when we speak to volunteers or we speak to team, we should do it like this or we should do it like this. And it's helped me in these things. And God has just done that. So when you come in and you're like, okay, God, let me be faithful with what is in front of me, with what opportunities, with what areas that you need me to be faithful in. It's amazing how God takes that faithfulness and adds the fruitfulness to it. And then you start to see the fruit from it. And I promise you, like, you're not the only person who will see the fruit from it.
Yes.
Other people will see the fruit from it.
You are in any way, shape, or form in a healthy organization.
You will see. It's very quick to go, oh, Brooker's just an easy example of a moment of where I run registrations for a lot of their large events. But the first time I did run registrations, all I did was sit there with a clipboard and like names and credit cards, but it was just very, like, the way it was being done was a little twitchy for me. And so I was like, hey, what if we move this and just this here? And like instantaneously the lines, we were able to get much, and the lady who was overseeing was like, hey, this worked really well, can you walk us through like how you did this so that we can do this? And then, like, so it wasn't just like I made a suggestion, we made some adjustments, but somebody else saw the fruit very quickly, so that now when you go, the way that the lines are, the way they move the tables and everything have been done because of just a moment of a single fruit. That was one moment of like a passing suggestion. But again, people see that. People see it and they take notes. So when you're being faithful, when you're just doing what you need to do and you're able to add in your flair to things, like better word for it.
We need to talk about
like
your
I
flair.
think that
21 pieces
there is,
of
and there
flair
is such.
on your uniform.
I love just exactly what you said. When we are looking at our organization, we're looking at Trinity New Life, and we're looking at the way people serve. There's something about the faithfulness of, hey, how can I help? That we see, and almost instantaneously, when people can come in with that, you start to see the fruit, not just like what they're doing, but you see the gravitational pull that they have to the other volunteers to pull them up to something where they become faithful as well. And you start to see these things, and then you start to see the TNLC leader in them being developed. Right. And that is that's one of my biggest joys, is when we can see that happening, when we start to see that transition from just, oh, I'll be faithful with a few, but then to start seeing the fruit coming from that, and the transformation into a TNLC leader is just incredible.
Yeah. You've got to be able to you can't despise the day of small beginnings. That's a good saying.
That's a good one.
We should write that down.
Write that down somewhere.
I just came up with that right there. Don't despise the day of small beginnings, because where you are is not where you're going to end up.
Right.
If where you're going to end up, if where you think you want to end up is where God's called you to be. Mm-hmm. I don't. Do you see a man? This is another saying that I just made up. These are all proverbs. Do you see a man or woman skilled in his work? They will not serve before obscure men. They will serve before kings.
Right.
And I think that if you go, well, I'm languishing being excellent at my job. One, you may not be as excellent as you think. Two, you might be working on character, like you said, and not just skill and talent. But eventually, it doesn't say they will never. It's, do you see a person skilled in their work? They're going to get in front of the right people.
Right.
And so our encouragement is, in that serving grace, wherever you go, wherever you look to serve.
Yeah.
And don't look to serve if, again, from a leader's perspective, from the senior pastor, from the lead pastor's perspective, senior pastor, whatever, executive director's perspective. When people come in and say, I only serve here, I only serve this way. I want leadership, that becomes a hesitant thing for us.
I'll do anything but, can I add that in there too? When they come in and say, I'll do anything but this. That's another one that, like, not just I'll only do.
Right, because why? You won't be discomforted?
Oh, because I do this all day long. Or I don't want to do this. Like, this is not something like that's the other one that you'll hear a lot of, like, I'll do anything, but don't make me talk to these people. Don't make me make a phone call, Sharon. Whatever they're saying,
Right. There might be hey, I don't think I'm best here.
Right.
And then you might be right about that, but there's an attitude of like, I don't want to do that.
Right.
But I will if it's needed.
Right.
There's a big difference between those two
very
things.
big.
So again, wherever you come in to serve. And whatever gifts and talents that you have, don't try to lead with gifts and talents. Try to lead with service, and God will make a way for those. So if you have questions, comments, suggestions,
all those things
for the follow-up, you can do so at podcast@trinitynewlife.com or on our Instagram, which is Trinity New Life as well. Nice to be back here in 2020. Brand new decade, first podcast of the decade.
It's a little chilly.
It's flipping freezing outside. So we will see you guys next week. Have a wonderful week. See you at the Night of Encouragement, Sunday morning. Bye-bye.
Bye.